Although the Korean War was far less expansive in terms of terrain and devastation compared to World War II, the conflict was in many ways a continuation of the previous war, using much of the same equipment, weapons, and soldiers. Recreating the Korean War with the expansions provided by Warfighter provides a unique insight into the difficult terrain and conditions of the conflict. When combining all 7 expansions dedicated to the Korean conflict, there are a total of 8 missions, 8 objectives, and 35 locations. The South Korean expansions showcase the battles that took place over the late spring, summer, and early months of the fall on the Korean peninsula. There are just 2 missions, 2 objectives, and 21 locations, which only hint at the breadth of the battles which took place. However, the China 1 and China 2 expansions, which are dedicated to the nationalist Chinese forces that took on the Japanese in the Second Sino-Japanese War, also includes 2 missions, 2 objectives, and 11 locations that share the same Far East designation as the missions in the South Korean expansions. This provides a greater range of options for those who want to explore more of the battles which took place during the warmer months of the war. But it was the harsh winter conditions that truly made the conflict unlike most of the battles fought in the Pacific theater during World War II. The only exception, perhaps, were the battles that took place on the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific. Both North Korean and the Third Chinese expansion offers 6 missions, 6 objectives, and 14 locations that feature the battles that took place during the winter months of the war, the cards designated as being Asia Winter. What follows is a compilation of all the expansions as previously covered on Seek Out and Play. Each one showcases the cards that make up the packs. On the 25th of June, 1950, the world changed. Across the 38th parallel, hundreds of thousands of North Korean soldiers poured into South Korea. The South Korean forces were brave and fought well, but with no tanks or heavy weapons, they were powerless to stop the onslaught. Expansions number 29 and number 30 of Warfighter World War II expands the frontier of the Warfighter series to the Korean War. Although separated by 5 years, many of the weapons and equipment used in World War II carried over into the Korean conflict. Warfighter World War II expansion number 29 includes 6-player, 2 non-player, and 5 squad soldiers, 11 weapons and 1 nation skill, 2 missions, 2 objectives, and 7 locations, 10 frontline, and 10 elite hostiles. Warfighter World War II expansion number 30 also includes 6-player, 2 non-player, and 5 squad soldiers, 7 weapons, 2 equipment, and 11 locations, along with 11 frontline and 12 elite hostiles. The determination of the South Korean, or ROK forces as they were known, is reflected in their nation skill, Fortitude. An ROK soldier may gain an experience point each time an attack from a hostile either suppresses or wounds them. All weapons in both expansions were first used either before or during World War II. They represent mostly American and Japanese weapons, such as the M1 and Type 99 rifles. The equipment offers cold weather gear, something quite important for the bitter winters that lay ahead. And the flare gun, which may provide an additional action for all soldiers, although it may also draw in reinforcements from the hostiles to the area. The missions and objectives of expansion number 29 reflect the early days of the conflict, which began in the summer. Up and Over and Get It Done are straightforward missions that reflect the speed of the North Korean advance, while Hold the Spur and Clear the House are objectives that focus on eliminating or keeping out hostiles from the area. The locations in both expansions showcase the rugged landscape of the Korean peninsula. The slopes, ditches, paths, and fields that make up the countryside are often difficult to move through, but they provide extra cover for the soldiers. As hostiles fighting the North Korean forces, the ROK offers a wide variety of troops ranging from pickets to ambushers, machine gun team, and the officer. In the first 5 days of the conflict, the South Korean army went from 95,000 to just 22,000 soldiers. They were brave, they were determined, but they were no match for the overwhelming forces of North Korea, the soldiers we will meet in the next chapter. The reunification of the Korean Peninsula began on the 25th of June, 1950. Hundreds of thousands of North Korean soldiers poured over the 38th parallel, quickly overrunning the outmatched South Korean forces. DVG presents 2 expansions that cover the North Korean side of the conflict, expanding the scope of the World War II era game to cover the Korean War. Warfighter World War II expansion number 26 includes 5-player, 4 non-player, and 4 squad soldiers, 9 weapon, 2 equipment, and 1 nation skill, 2 mission, 2 objectives, and 6 locations, 10 frontline, and 10 elite hostiles. Warfighter World War II expansion number 27 includes 5-player, 4 non-player, and 4 squad soldiers, 7 weapon, 3 skill, and 1 nation skill, 2 mission, 2 objectives, and 10 locations, 8 frontline, and 10 elite hostiles. The North Korean soldiers are tough, hardy, and well acclimated to the cold weather conditions. Their weapons mostly come from Chinese and Russian sources. They represent the vast, leftover production that came from World War II and found their way into North Korea. The equipment represents the preparation for the frigid conditions that the winter months bring. The bugle allows for extra movement for all soldiers for just a single action. The nation skill for the North Korean army is determination. When a soldier with determination is killed, that soldier gets 1 more action attack. 1 is added to the defeat cover die roll, and 3 added to the attack roll. Mountaineer, warm-blooded, and demolitions help make up the character of the North Korean soldier. Both North Korean expansions bring with them the fierce Asia winter that helps make the conflict even more challenging. The mission, objective, and location cards all reflect the harsh, cold conditions that dominated many of the winter battles. The 4 mission cards represent the typical conflicts that occurred during this time when the war bogged down. The 4 objectives are straightforward and focus on control and elimination of hostiles, which reflect the brutal nature of the conflict. The locations, combined with the missions and objectives, introduce the Asia winter. Deep drifts, frozen ditches, icy terraces, wind-swept plains, and more. The feeling of bitter cold comes through with virtually every location presented. As hostiles going up against the South Korean and UN forces, the North Korean frontline and elite soldiers represent a wide array of challenges. From snipers and holdouts to the famous Russian T-34-85 tanks, the hostiles represent a formidable opponent for the ROK and UN forces to defeat. For the first few months of the war, it appeared that North Korea would sweep the entire countryside and take over the peninsula. Only the timely intervention of UN forces would prevent complete capitulation. Due to the Soviet Union not participating in the UN Security Council's decision to fight, soldiers from different countries under the leadership of the United Nations joined together to stop the North Korean advance. The UN expansion represents an interesting release for Warfighter. Instead of focusing on a single country, this is an organization which consists of different nations all fighting on the same side. Warfighter World War II expansion number 31 includes 9-player, 4 non-player, and 4 squad soldiers, 4 weapon and 1 equipment, 7 skill and 1 nation skill, 12 frontline, and 14 elite hostiles. There are no missions, objectives, or locations in this expansion. It is meant to be incorporated with other expansions in the Korean conflict. The soldiers represent a wide range of nations as indicated by the flags located in the upper left corner of each soldier card. One interesting aspect of the soldiers is that there is no inherent hardy skill for cold. Considering how much of the conflict takes place in the Asia winter, at least in Warfighter, it may pay to get some winter gear. The weapons are mostly of U.S. origin and include the M2 carbine, which was first deployed at the end of World War II. It is interesting that the United Nations is not a single nation, but still has a nation skill: mutual support. Mutual support allows the UN player once per mission to discard a hostile reinforcement card before it is placed. This means upon seeing a particularly fearsome hostile, the skill will allow it to be sent straight to the discard pile. Of the 7 skills included, 5 are specialist, which reflect the experience that many of the soldiers went through during World War II. The other 2 skills, Zippo and Demolitions, have been included in previous releases. As hostiles, the UN forces offer considerable opposition. In addition to the typical machine gun teams, reinforcers, and recruits, there are tanks as well. From the World War II classic M4A3 Sherman to the more modern M24 and M26, the tanks featured in the UN expansion offer a powerful opponent to overcome. After the successful landing at Incheon, the UN forces led by General MacArthur raced into North Korea and toward the Yalu River. Warnings that the Chinese might intervene were ignored, and for a time it seemed that the war would come to a fast conclusion, but the Chinese had something else in mind. As UN forces raced northward to the Yalu River, it seemed that victory was assured with the North Korean forces melting before them. However, from across the Yalu came a new threat, one that would forever change the course of the war and threaten to wipe the UN and South Korean forces from the peninsula. Warfighter World War II expansion number 28 is the 3rd expansion for China, the previous 2 focusing on the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937. This expansion includes 6-player, 4 non-player, and 5 squad soldiers, 9 weapon, 6 skill, and 1 nation skill, 2 mission and 2 objectives, 11 frontline, and 10 elite hostiles. Experience, fortitude, and excelling at hand-to-hand fighting, the typical Chinese soldier is tough and determined. However, as during the Second Sino-Japanese War, they often lack the equipment and weaponry of their enemies. The Recruit Nation skill is identical to the Recruit Nation skill found in the previous 2 Chinese expansion packs. For a single action and the cost of a squad soldier through experience points, a new squad soldier is placed into the mission at the location of the paying soldier. As experience points grow, a horde of squad soldiers may be brought onto the Chinese side, which reflects the overwhelming nature of the Chinese advance into the Korean peninsula. The skills reflect the vast experience of the Chinese army that it gained with its conflict with Japan. The weapons are mostly from the pre-World War II era, the same as the nationalist and communist forces used in resisting the Japanese invasion. However, the Type 50 submachine gun and the Type 36 recoilless rifles were produced just at the beginning of the Korean conflict. This makes them some of the newest weapons that were used in the fighting in the Warfighter series. The Winter Patrol is pretty basic, but the Winter Holding missions team up with a Winter Fallback objective. The Winter T-34 objectives provides an interesting challenge for the ROK and UN forces. There are no location cards, so those who want to recreate the winter battles of the war will need to use the Asia Winter cards from the North Korea expansions. As hostiles, the Chinese offer a formidable opponent for the UN and ROK forces. It is the sheer numbers as reflected in the reticles. With more troops to take down, it makes it more difficult to advance to the objective. The surprise intervention of the Chinese forces caused the UN and ROK soldiers to fall back into South Korean territory. The war, that was seemingly going to be over by Christmas 1950, now had no end in sight. Although the most notable advancement in military technology from World War II to the Korean War was the development of the jet fighter, tanks also had made considerable advancements. The outbreak of the Korean conflict put much of this technology to the test, given the difficult countryside of the Korean peninsula. The vehicles are separated into 4 groups: North Korea and the Chinese versus South Korea and the United Nations. The North Koreans and Chinese each have 12 vehicles and 18 anti-vehicle cards, while the South Koreans and the UN have 10 vehicles each, but the South Koreans have 15 anti-vehicle cards, while the UN has 17 anti-vehicle cards. While North Korea did not manufacture any tanks or heavy vehicles, they did rely on equipment sent by the Soviet Union. The Soviet tanks included in the expansion begin with the classic T-34 armed with the 85mm gun, one of the most highly produced tanks during World War II. The IS-2 heavy tank made its initial appearance in 1944, replacing the KV-1. Its main feature was the massive 122mm gun, which was quite powerful and slow to reload. The GAZ-67 was the successor to the GAZ-64. It was the Soviet equivalent to the American Jeep. The BA-4 armored car was built on the chassis of the GAZ-67. It entered service in 1941 and remained the only armored car the Soviets ever produced. While it may be surprising to see the inclusion of two American tanks, the M3 Stuart and M4 Sherman, entering service in 1941 and 1942 respectively, they were part of the Lend-Lease program between the U.S. and Soviet Union during World War II. The Chinese vehicles are virtually identical to the North Korean vehicles in this Warfighter expansion. During the initial stages of the war, the South Koreans did not have any heavy tanks or weaponry to stop the North Korean assault, so it's not surprising that virtually all the tanks and armored vehicles are American-made. The M4 Sherman and M24 Chaffee both saw action during World War II. Both vehicles were still in service at the time and provided to the South Korean Army once the UN arrived on the scene. The M26 Pershing arrived just at the end of World War II. It represented a significant upgrade in technology, and it served as the design basis for the M46 Patton. The Patton entered service in 1949 and was the principal medium tank of the American Armed Forces at the time. The anti-vehicle cards for both sides mirror the vehicles included for each of the forces represented. The other anti-vehicle cards, or hostiles, are soldiers who target vehicles, or event-type cards that punish opposing vehicles. After China's entry, the war in Korea dragged on with both sides advancing and retreating across the peninsula. It was not until July 27, 1953, that a ceasefire agreement was made, but the war itself has never officially ended. By combining all 6 Korean War infantry with the Vehicle Cards No. 4 expansion, you can recreate much of the conflict that dominated the war. You can also add expansions that include the Far East missions, locations, and terrain, such as found in the China 1 and China 2 expansion packs for even more options. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next Wednesday.